Right. I guess we can just start right now. Thanks to all the participants for joining us today. Of course, the subject of end-of-life projects for renewables here in Europe is like not really proven in practice to a large extent due to very, very limited number of cases. But anyway, from economic point of view, from a valuation point of view, on which our colleagues from Mazars will have a presentation, it may be very important as it comes to like building the economic model for the investment project. Also, from like legal point of view, there are some things to be considered whilst building a business plan for a project, and then of course negotiating agreements and planning the whole operations, and then the commissioning and dismantling or repowering of an installation. Just without further ado, thank you for joining us today, and I will just pass the voice to Radosław from Mazars. After that, my colleague Daniel Arena and myself will have a brief regulatory legal review of the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Grzegorz. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Forvis Mazars, I'd like to introduce Karishma Merchant, our female colleague from London office, and I'd like to present myself as a director in our Warsaw practice responsible for valuations. We have prepared a presentation for you that we're going to show you in a second. First, over to Karishma, and then I will take over from her. Karishma, you're muted, I think.
Thanks, Radek. If you move on to the next slide, maybe just a quick introduction. So, hello, everyone. I'm Karishma Merchant. I'm a director in the infrastructure and energy team at Forvis Mazars. I'm based out of the London office, and I co-lead the infrastructure and energy valuation service line. So let's get started with the key issues that we wanted to discuss with you today. The main focus is on how to value projects at the end of life and why this is of interest to us. Now, normally, when you look at infrastructure and energy projects, you have a set of cash flows which go over many, many years. And we've shown on the graph on the right-hand side a standard set of cash flows where you would have an initial period of capex where the cash flows would be negative. You would then go on to having many years of positive cash flows. And depending on the nature of the project and the money set aside, you may end up having decommissioning costs or handback costs at the end of the project life. Depending upon how much money is set aside or how the economy changes, the decommissioning costs could end up becoming quite significant in terms of value. So in a situation where you have decommissioning costs which end up becoming significantly negative and result in overall negative cash flows of the project, this results in a very interesting challenge from a valuation perspective. We've given an example of an oil field because we've seen this increasingly happening with oil and gas projects. Like Grzegorz mentioned, we haven't had many projects which have actually seen the end of life in the renewable energy space or in the PPP, PFI space. But if you look at, say, an oil field, for example, under normal valuation principles, the greater the uncertainty, the higher the discount rate that one would apply. And if we look at the graph on the right-hand side, if you were valuing a project at the start of its life, you would think of applying a higher discount rate to reflect the higher uncertainty. What happens in this case? So the higher the discount rate, the lower the value. So the graph at the bottom shows that when you have discount rates plotted from, say, 0 to 20%, you have a situation where your value will be higher at lower discount rates and lower. But suppose if you were valuing the project at the end of life, say towards the end of life. So if you're valuing the project in, say, year 20 or year 25, you've now covered a large chunk of the positive cash flows, and you then have negative cash flows towards the end. In this case, the situation gets absolutely reversed, because if you apply a higher discount rate, you won't end up with a lower value, but you'll end up with a higher value. So that's what the graph shows over here, that the higher the discount rate, the higher the value. And that's where this relationship becomes very significant. And we would then need to analyze the uncertainty relating to the cash flows and apply different types of approaches. Uh, if we move on to the next slide, we've discussed where these approaches can actually take place. So we've given a few examples of oil and gas projects, PPP projects, and renewable energy. I'll touch upon these very quickly because I think Radek will then go into detail on the renewable energy projects. Um, in case of oil and gas projects, again, because of the uncertainty, you would still use a DCF, but you then need to apply a very prudent approach in terms of what the decommissioning cost estimates are. The valuation would need to incorporate any decommissioning reserves as well, because if there are reserves that have been set aside to offset against the actual cost to be incurred, that would help offset any expected liability. However, there could be unexpected liabilities, which is where this negative cash flow scenario could come in. If you look at PPP, in Poland, there haven't been many projects. We haven't seen the end of life of various projects. But if you look at, for example, other countries, maybe UK, over the next 5 to 10 years, there are over 300 projects that are going to reach end of life. So, this situation then becomes very relevant for certain countries which are nearing their PPP handback clauses. In these cases, a higher discount rate to cover the end of life would not necessarily work. So again, a lot of different approaches can be applied to ensure that the valuation is correctly reflecting the expected returns from the project towards the end of life. Uh, on renewable energy projects, we've seen that it's very unclear whether the projects will be decommissioned or repowered, and Radek will touch more on this. It is common in the renewable energy sector to assume that decommissioning costs will be offset by scrap value, um, or they can be avoided through a potential repowering. And as the project moves near to the end of life, there is likely to be increased certainty. When you're valuing at the start of the project, it's a bit more uncertain what may happen 30 years down the line. But as you reach, year 20 or year 25, there is greater clarity over what level of costs may have to be incurred at that point. Um, I think with that, I would probably hand over to Radek to discuss the renewable energy sector decommissioning costs in greater detail.
Thank you. Moving on to my section, I'm going to cover the dismantling costs, proceeds from scrap recycling, costs of land recultivation. Then I'm going to show you two real-life cases of proposals from a dismantling firm to dismantle a wind farm, and then show you how this can be used to calculate asset retirement obligation. The wind farms have a limited service life, which can span up to 30 years. Beyond that time, the turbines are usually used up to the extent that it's uneconomically viable to overhaul them. In terms of the photovoltaic panels, they can operate also for the long term, but even longer than the wind farms. And for that reason, there is so far very scarce information in terms of the net salvage value which can be expected from big photovoltaic farms. So for this reason, I'm going to focus in my presentation on the wind farm for now. But just as a side note, to give you a feeling of how much dismantling of a photovoltaic farm can cost, I came across an a study done by Electric Power Research Institute, which estimated that in April 2018, the decommissioning of a representative ground-mounted crystalline silicon power plant of 11 megawatts would cost around $900,000. So that translates into $83,000 per megawatt. So that gives you a flare of where this is compared to the wind farms, which are usually more costly to dismantle. And the way this is done is usually by controlled demolition using simply explosives. In terms of the top-down disassembly, this is rarely done, usually for maintenance to replace wind blades or parts of the engine. And as Karishma mentioned, there is a simplified modeling assumption that you can meet that the decommissioning and recultivation costs can offset the proceeds from scrap. But in real life, this is always dependent upon the technology and the location of the site. Think in terms offshore, for example. And it may be the case that commissioning costs may be significant and the proceeds from scrap may not be sufficient to cover those. In terms of the proceeds from scrap recycling, you can assume that 90% of the turbine, not the farm, but the turbine, can be recycled, and that comes predominantly from its steel engine and the camshaft in it. But the biggest problem, as most of us know, is the fiberglass blades, which are made of materials that are glued together. That makes them durable, but also hardly economically viable to recycle. And so it's much cheaper to burn them or to deposit in landfills. Due to environmental hazards and concerns with that, a company like Vattenfall decided that it's going to have its rotor blades recycled up to 50% by next year, and all of them by 2030 when they are dismantled. But until then, the blades will usually continue to undergo a typical thermal recycling process in the cement industry. Glass fiber composite material is used instead of heavy crude oil in that case. Another way of getting rid of the used up blades is by repurposing them as small urban architecture objects, such as bus stops, benches, or playgrounds for children, or in the construction and automotive industry. When looking at the wind farm site, you also may expect significant proceeds from the sale of stripped down aluminum and copper from cables dug out of the ground, and some proceeds from the selling of steel from metal casings of energy converters. But this is usually included in the proposals from the dismantling companies. When it comes to land recultivation, a stereotypical approach is to leave the roads on the site. The cables will be dug out because of the value in them. The foundations will be crushed, but not very deep, just 30 centimeters below the surface. And the area will be refilled with gravel or dirt, and substations will be demobilized and removed from the site. The most significant cost element is the renting of heavy equipment needed to do it. Think of cranes or bulldozers or trucks to get rid of the scrap from the site. And also several days of manpower need to be included in the budget. Sometimes when there is repowering, it's not always the case that there is a ratio of one new wind turbine per one old one. For example, in Hagshaw Hills in Scotland, a wind farm will be repowered, and out of 26 of its old turbines, 14 new will emerge. So that gives us a ratio of almost one new per two old. And I read that this can reach as much as one new per 10 old ones. This is due to the fact that there is a trend of upscaling the megawatts of a wind farm. This is one of the proposals from an undisclosed client of ours. You can see that this consists of two sections. The upper one consists of full contract price for 12 Vestas, and there is a calculation, an average calculation per one turbine. And this is achieved after applying a 25% discount to the list prices below in the second section of the proposal. And from that, you can see that initially the list price says that dismantling of one turbine of this size, which is a medium size, 3.3 megawatts, would cost around 1 million zloty, which is 260,000 euro. But after this 25% discount, you can drop down to almost 200,000 euro, which is 800,000 zloty. And on our next case, we can see that this discount can be negotiated even further, up to 28% over here. But in this case, there is less turbines to be dismantled, and also they are smaller. So always negotiate. In this case, the cost of dismantling of one turbine drops to 170,000 euro, which is 740,000 zloty. And just a quick reminder of some of the regulations which affect the costs of decommissioning. You can find it in IAS 16 in property, plant and equipment, where it says that the dismantling and recultivation costs, they can constitute parts of the initial valuation of a property, plant and equipment item. So when you recognize it on the balance sheet, you can increase it by the estimate. And also IFRS 37, provisions, contingent liabilities, and contingent assets, present guidelines for calculations of provisions for dismantling costs. Specifically, it indicates that risk-free rate may be used to discount the estimate which we are going to bear in the future to the current period. And the numerical example of that is shown on the next slide, where I'm using those two presented dismantling proposals. You can see those average dismantling costs per the medium turbine in the second line above, 194,000 euro per one, and the dismantling costs for another one, the smaller one, of 172,000 euros. And two sections below illustrate how this can be calculated. So what you do first is you index it into the future until the expected economic useful life of the asset. You index it by the current price index. Currently, we can use the National Bank of Poland's most recent forecast in the lower right corner. And then you're applying a discount factor using the risk-free rate, which 2 days ago was at 5.7%. And that boils down to the current value at the end of December. For the balance sheet purposes, for example, you would get 87,000 euro for the medium-sized wind farm. And for the smaller wind farm, you would get 74,500 euro of required provision. As you can see, that translates into much less than the nominal amount quoted by the demolition company. So your provision does not need to recognize the whole amount just yet. It unwraps in time until you are able to perform the demolition and perhaps update the proposed costs. I think I was able to fit my presentation in the due time, so thank you for your attention, and over to Bird&Bird.
Oops. Thank you very much, guys. Actually, from as I mentioned at the very beginning, the legal aspects of this are quite devoid of real life cases yet. Still, so what we are working here on is mainly related to the general provisions related to dismantling, but also some specific aspects considering repowering of installations, especially wind farms in Poland, which may be a little bit difficult due to the distance regulations. And also some specific regulatory aspects. After me and my colleague Daniel Arane from Hungary would be working on his presentation with you, and there you will find probably much more much better deliberated regulations related to waste management, with some also comments from my side in a few minutes. So let's begin. Yeah, so for the end of operating life, we just actually have several options. One may be the complete decommissioning of the project's assets, all the associated infrastructure. First, with disassembly, which may in some cases require additional disassembly permit or notification, management of components and waste, turbines, arrays, batteries, other infrastructure being removed, and the waste producer and all the permits. This is very specific regulation, at least in Poland, just because you can actually outsource not only the service as such, but also the responsibility from like in a legal meaning of this word, and public law meaning, which is quite a rarity, of course. Land remediation, restoration, and the responsibility for decommissioning activities. And here what is quite important is the wording of the LLA, of course. In case applicable, like generally speaking, it should be the responsibility of the investor. But in some cases, we have seen situations in which the land lease agreements did not provide security to the landowners. But also, on the other hand, in more and more cases, we see that also the investors or developers are just proposing in the first draft the provisions which serve the purpose of like securing this land remediation and restoration process, and restoring the original quality of the land. For repowering, as replacing all the generating installations with new ones, it may of course be partial. So, replacing some specific components without changing specific physical parameters, like size of the given component, but increasing, for example, its installed capacity, but also full repowering, which means like going down to the ground with the current installation and setting up of a new one. And what is, of course, very important here is that in most cases, this like a brand new approach would be interesting in case of wind farms. And in Poland, we still have, of course, the legislative works are I'd say, ongoing on managing this historical issue already. So actually in Poland, we had an idea to provide conditions for like quite unlimited development of PV projects of course, like very specific profile, and to actually ban to large extent development of wind farms at the same time. So just by introducing that so-called 10H rule, 10H rule related to like the distance of the wind farms from the nearest buildings, and also the requirement to set up of the wind farms based on the specific provisions related provisions of the local spatial planning documentation, which is quite a rarity. And in some cases, we have wind farms which are like operating and in relation to which it would be considerable option to repower this kind of installation, and for example, like change the wind turbines, providing a less number of this, like but larger capacity and higher capacity. And in case where the wind farm was not subject to the 10H rule, which was introduced in legislation of 2016, starting from 2017. And this may be the case that such a repowering may require new or replacing building permit. And if that was the case, and the installation does not comply with the distance limitation, of course, as I mentioned, it has been partially liberalized. Right now, it's like 700 meters, which does not really change a lot anyway. But if this is the case, that before the regulation it has been built and operated, and right now if we want to get the new building permit for repowering, it may turn out that we will not be able to do so due to this distance limit legislation. As I mentioned, there are works on that, draft law is underway. So hopefully there will be some changes in the framework in the nearest future. In some cases, of course, the partial repowering may not require any replacement building permit, which would be much easier also in such cases. But anyway, of course, if we go for like a full replacement of an installation, we have to go through disassembly, waste management, and of course then for repowering purposes, partial remediation or land restoration can be like subject to discussions and the negotiations with the landowner. Actually, there also is a provision introduced to our building law related specifically to wind farms. The general rule is that if an unused, unfinished object is unsuitable for repair, reconstruction, finishing, the construction supervision authority in Poland shall issue a decision ordering the owner or asset manager to demolish the building and clean up the site, and also setting deadlines for commencing and finishing of such works. The above also shall apply to entirety of a wind power plant. Entirety means like not only the construction part, so like BOP, etc., but also the associated infrastructure, anything placed on the land. and the entity obliged to demolish and restore the used land to original state should be, in case of like failed project, entity which obtained a building permit but failed to obtain the occupancy permit. And in case of like operating installations of where an occupancy permit was obtained, the actually last operator, most recent operator of the wind power plant. For other installations, it's the rule is, of course, that obligations associated with disassembly, cleaning up of site, land restoration shall be secured under the LLA. There are also some specific provisions of energy law and requirements put down in generation licenses, which I will refer to shortly. The general practice right now and like predominantly present in negotiations of like land lease agreements, if that's the case, is kind of a collateral obligation or requirement. Sometimes it takes a form of like parent company guarantee or maybe a bank guarantee, but provided like for the only after like the majority of the term already elapsed. So like for like 2 or 3 last years of the LLA being in force, to secure these obligations of the investor. And in the event, of course, where we have a situation that the LLA has expired, the term has expired, but still this obligation has not been fulfilled, there is a non-contractual use of the land by the investor and subject to additional payments or damages. There's also a specific regulatory regime under building law for disassembly of projects. And this monthly permit is a very special one, which is generally required, like with 2 exemptions. Buildings and constructions which are not listed in the register of monuments, not covered by conservation protection, which does not really have to be like protection of monuments or anything, but with any kind of protection for, like, for example, environmental purposes, with a height of less than 8 meters, and if the distance from the border of the plot is not less than half the height. And this exemption may meet some quite specific and maybe also a little bit funny cases in practice. For example, there were some cases in which construction which actually fulfilled this height criteria and was not covered by any protection area, was located at just like at the border of 2 plots belonging to different landowners. It's actually, from administrative point of view, it's possible in Poland. But so actually in this situation, it was the case that despite other conditions being fulfilled, due to lack of a distance from the border of a plot, being less than half, being not less than half the height of a construction, it did require the dismantling permit. And in such cases, also the prior notification is required to the competent authority, and this notification may result in the authority requiring actually the investor to go through the whole procedure and actually obtain the permit. So the authority can oppose like the notification in 21 days period, and in case it doesn't do so, it means that we have like a tacit acceptance. But also due to like different requirements regarding protection of ownership of especially related to neighboring objects or lands, or to environmental aspects. This may be the case that after the notification, the authority will decide that even though these conditions were fulfilled, the dismantling permit will be required anyway. And the second situation, which is, I'd say, quite a safe option, objects and facilities for the construction of which a building permit is not required if these are not protected as monuments. And in such case, we also do not need to go with a notification. And such cases may, of course, also not require a dismantling permit, or may not like trigger the right of the authority to require the dismantling permit to be obtained anyway. But of course, this like the building permit is required for most of like economically important objects in the energy industry. For example, like PV installations up to 150 kilos do not require building permit. So this is the really small scale, and in many cases this will apply to some specific fencing installations or some additional infrastructure, but not to the constructions as such. This is the case. What is more, of course, the use of explosives for demolition purposes, also mentioned by colleagues from Mazars. There is a specific regulation concerning the manner and conditions for carrying out of procedure and dealing with blasting works. It regulates also the manner of the protection and securing the neighboring lands and environmental conditions. Also, the blasting works, carrying out of the blasting works require additional notification, or actually information being given to several administrative bodies, like among others the police, 7 days before starting of these kind of demolition works, and this kind of authorities may supervise also this blasting works being carried out. Sorry, beg your pardon, some energy required. So for managing of the components waste management, most important local aspects, I'd say, is the definition of a waste producer. So the entity which is responsible for waste management, the producers of waste generated as a result of the provision of services for construction, demolition, repair of facilities, cleaning, maintenance, or repair of facilities, or also dismantling, will be the entity that provides the service, unless the service contract stipulates otherwise. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's like a very specific kind of a provision which actually associated some kind of public law obligations like registering in the special evidence, like liability for the waste and for passing it on to the authorized off-takers and recycling entities. May be like delegated contractually to other entity which provides services in like everyday operations of, like, for example, wind farm. It may be like at the end of, for example, O&M contractor. Yeah, and in case of demolition dismantling, it may be the case that some additional contract will be provided, or some specific provisions may be put down in the contract with the supplier of some of batteries, for example, or PV panels, which I'll also delve briefly into shortly. In general, like, waste management should be carried out based on the waste generation permits. And this is like required from the producer of waste. Yeah, so also, as I mentioned, in this this kind of obligation and regulatory framework may be applicable sorry, either to investor, operator, or the service provider in such cases. So the delegation also relates to it. Also, the waste should be stored selectively. It's like not really specific here as to the local regulations, and the holder of waste should keep quantitative, qualitative records of waste and submit it to the relevant authorities. It also may be outsourced. For recycling companies and the responsibility of producer responsibility obligation organizations, there are actually two sources of income, which is collection of waste and sale, of course, of recovered raw materials, of course, as you could have seen from the presentations of Mazars as well, how it works. Important aspect is the extended producer responsibility and change in law, also related to waste batteries and accumulators directive, and which will be replaced by which is replaced actually, and gradually phased out by batteries regulation of the EU, and which introduces this extended producer responsibility, and the producer or like entity which introduces the batteries or the finder of like industrial batteries for battery storage can choose whether to comply with the extended producer responsibility individually or via an organization. In actually probably all of the member states in EU, there are such organizations set up. What is here important may be that collection must be organized by the producers or collection points, and it should be free of charge for end users. Actually, not really free of charge. You are paying for this, like in advance, in your supply contracts or other contracts with the producers in the first place. But then after the end of life, it should be taken from you free of charge. It's like the general rule to be applied. Last important aspects I wanted to refer to briefly. As I mentioned, of course, this is like land restoration. We have observed like quite a lot of different cases and some new practice related to the wording of land lease agreements. but also important aspects related to licensing under the energy law. So first, there is an obligation, and it's like more generally first set out in the energy law, but also in the conditions of each individual generation license, to notify the President of Energy Regulatory Office on the planned discontinuation of the license activity, and we have to do it like 18 months prior to the actual cessation. And also, in addition, we as a generator, as licensee or concessionaire, if you will, have to present the analysis like of technical, financial, and also the environmental impact related to the activity which we anticipate to terminate or to discontinue, determining, like, among others, the obligations in relation to third parties, like also including the liquidation of the effects of activities like restoration of the land, etc. Why is it important as a protection or safeguard? Actually, it brings some security to third parties, and just because if any entity, even an SPV, just as an example, just do not do so and just cease to exist and does not do anything with the licensing, with the notification, and does not submit this analysis related and does not fulfill any obligations towards third parties. First, the license as such may be withdrawn if, of course, the SPV is not liquidated yet, or but also afterwards the obtaining of a new license, but such an entity or also entity from the same group may be put at risk, as the authority may perceive that the applicant does not provide like the guarantee that that this licensed activity will be provided in a correct manner, or require like additional collateral or guarantee to be provided. And yeah, that's all at my end. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll just pass the voice to Daniel and maybe some other questions afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Daniel Rányi, partner at the Budapest office of Bird&Bird, heading the energy team and the competition team here in Budapest. It was very interesting that you mentioned the waste aspects of decommissioning, and this is what I will be focusing on more, giving you a deeper dive and some examples. In terms of repowering and decommission, you also touched upon this, Greg. Thanks for this. I just wanted to note that in Hungary, as the colleagues from Mazars also mentioned, there's not much examples of decommissionings yet of renewables as of today. So it is yet to be seen how this is actually going to work en masse in Hungary and all across Europe, I guess. And the reason for this is, for example, in Hungary, there was a similar ban as in Poland on wind farm deployment. There were wind farms constructed between 2005 and 2011 when the possibility to build wind farms just disappeared. Luckily, in Hungary, there's been some regulatory changes recently, just the beginning of this year, which now again make it possible for wind farms to be constructed. So I guess we're just one step ahead of Poland in this respect. But anyway, so the first wind farms were built in around 2005 and 6, and their expected lifetime expires in 35, 36, which means probably only the damaged blades would be the ones that came into picture in terms of what to do with them once they were removed from the turbines. In case of PV, the large ramp up of PV capacities in Hungary started in 2014. There was a big momentum starting there, and still keeps going. But that also means that in case of PV, the case is very similar. So at least it's usually 20-25 years for life expectancy for a PV plant, or even longer, which means there hasn't been any major dismantling yet of large PV plants. Hydro is a different story. There has been cases of repowering. One example here is Gibart, operated by the Alteo Group in Northeast Hungary, which was refurbished several times. I think the last time was in 2020. But there are more smaller hydropower plants in Hungary, which were established quite long ago, and their life expectancy always got renewed through refurbishments and repowering projects, which is a good thing. It does have the aspects of waste management, but that again is not in such a big mass as we will expect once the wind and PV plants get ripe for either repowering or decommission. But let's have a look at what our colleagues from Mazars were calculating in numbers. Let me show you a little bit of the regulatory background to the waste management framework. In probably the most important part to this is the extended producer responsibility system that was enacted in Hungary as of 1st of July last year, so quite new. This was part of the project to reshape Hungary's waste management system altogether, which was turned into a concessionaire system where MOHU, which is part of the MOL group, is the main the concessionaire, and it is now the competence of this company MOHU to be also the PRO, the organization which Greg also mentioned, responsible for the collective discharge of the extended producer responsibility. There may be opt-outs, especially in the WEEE region for non-residential waste, but it generally is actually discharged by MOHU as the PRO. So I already mentioned there are special rules which were introduced by an EU directive. So it is the framework is harmonized across the EU, but there are specific decrees in case of Hungary implementing this directive, and there are a lot of details which might differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And just before, well before the entry into effect of the EPR system, there was also an environmental product fee regime in Hungary. Well, it still is in effect, and it kind of has a parallel life with the EPR system. You'll see the Hungarian legislative framework on the right. Probably what's important to point out is the waste hierarchy, which sits and the basis of the waste regulations across the EU. So obviously the first step is to prevent and reduce waste, and then we get to reuse and recycle. So this is what we should be considering, not only we, but also producers of the PV panels and inverters and other components of renewables installations as well. In case of, so I just wanted to flash the major waste streams in case of the largest renewable projects and how these come into picture when you need to dismantle them and how it needs to be dealt with as waste. So in case of PV panels, PV power plants, there is an upfront fee which is being paid when you purchase the PV panels. This is now an EPR fee because that actually subsumes the environmental product fee, which was earlier introduced on PV panels. That was a very interesting governmental decision at the time. It was introduced, the environmental product fee was introduced in 2015 for PV panels, just after kind of the big kickoff and the big momentum starting for solar installations in 2014, with big political support. So that was kind of an interesting turn, and it also created a lot of ripples and objections in the market because, having said that, the PV will be the technology of choice for renewables in Hungary starting in the early 2010s. In 2015, there comes this roadblock which created, and there was quite a high environmental product fee imposed on the panels. It's actually double of what you need to pay now as an EPR fee, which was then moderated in time. It was decreased and now subsumed by the EPR fee. But anyways, it was an interesting turn of events for the PV industry. I mean, it didn't break the momentum, but it was something that needed to, or required kind of a recalculation of business plans at that time. So the PV panels are considered as waste of electric equipment, and these are collected by either the producer or MOHU as the PRO, as I mentioned. Similar for the inverters, those are also WEE equipment and needs to be disposed of accordingly. In case of wind turbines, my colleagues also touched upon this. So most waste is recoverable as scrap metal in case of wind turbines, and the challenge remains the generators and the rotors of the blades of the turbines. It is interesting that there's no specific regulations just yet for the disassembly of wind turbines and how these components will be handled or should be handled. So there's no specific rule for this, and it might be something for the legislator to consider, as this is creating a lot of disturbance in other countries, as in the EU as well as in the US. For example, in the US, they're being put in landfills. In the EU, as the colleagues from Mazars mentioned, there is a big push to be able to create renewable wind rotors. and which can be reused, or technologies that should be or need to be further developed to be able to reuse and recycle these kind of waste. And the third I wanted to mention is construction and demolition waste. These has a separate regime that applies to this specific waste. It needs to be collected selectively or in certain waste groups that is defined in the relevant legislation. And there are certain registration obligations that need to be observed when the construction or the demolition is taking place. In any event, this is something that needs to be taken into account. So there are different kinds of waste and different kinds of procedures that you need to observe and that you need to follow with respect to the different kinds of waste that can come with the demolition and decommissioning. So it is, although well harmonized across the EU through the directives, there may be and there are significant differences of how these regimes actually look like and how these have been put into practice and implemented in each of the EU jurisdictions. So it is important to be aware of the different rules in the different countries, but the main principles are harmonized, and we can, I believe, be sure that this is something that will continue to go on, and possibly there will be more push in the coming years also from the EU to create more sustainable procedures for dealing with waste, especially in case of the PV panels and the problematic parts of wind turbines. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have in connection with waste management. I think we've received quite a few questions.
I think, Daniel, there's a question probably for you. This says, does only the company or the subcontractor doing the dismantling work need to register with the BDO? Is this something for
Video
you
is
or for Greg? Okay.
Video is sorry, I cannot. Oh yes, it's down below. Only the company or subcontractor doing dismantling work. Yeah, so for the BDO, actually, any entity which is a waste producer has to register. And of course have a number. If an operator has a permit for like integrated permit or waste permit, it has to register and also to have the evidence of the waste generated. And there was also another question, probably related to my part. Oh yes, related to my part, in considering how often do we see collaterals in land lease agreements being required. Actually, the case is that in the past we have seen, in many times we have seen that this was not the case really. But right now, also due to like development of the market, more and more often the landlords, also like agricultural producers, for example, who have a large arrears of real estate to be to be subject to LLA, just go for some advice to be provided and for a legal check of the agreements proposed by developers, and have it covered. But also, what is, I'd say, quite a positive practice, at least in my view, is the fact that more and more often we see that also the developers themselves propose kind of a security, like a money deposit, for example, or kind of a guarantee to be provided, but at the, as I mentioned, near to death stage of the project to be provided to the landlord, just just for the landlord to have all this secured and feel safe. Let's say that like the initiative of the developer in this aspect is just very like positive in like for a sustainable business point of view first, of course, but also from the perspective of like carrying out of a licensed business activity in Poland, for what I mentioned in case of like obligations related to cessation of economic activity by SPVs, for example, within a group. Yeah. So first, of course, it's like a goodwill anyway, but also method for positive compliance with obligations thereof.
I think there were a few other questions, but most of them have been answered in the chat itself, especially the ones that Radoslaw has answered. Are you all able to see any other questions?
I think there are no more questions. We could probably wrap up. All right. On behalf of Mazars, thank you very much for your attention. I was told that the presentation will be distributed among the participants. So please await.
There's also our contact data there at the end of the presentation. So also please feel free to reach out to our colleagues from Mazars or to Daniel and myself in case of questions or any need of an urge to follow up or get some additional insight from us. Thanks.
And great thanks to our colleagues from Bird&Bird for this opportunity to present ourselves jointly.